So, good morning, everybody. I'm sorry I'm not able to be with you today, and that I haven't been able to hear all of the previous presentations. I hope you can see the screen okay, and that I'm not going too fast for anybody. Just wanted to start off by introducing myself. I'm a speech and language therapist, and I've been working internationally, mainly in sub-Saharan Africa and a little bit in Sri Lanka for the last almost 30 years. I put together the presentation today. Really, it's about thoughts and responses to working in multidisciplinary teams internationally, and I've gathered together comments from a number of my colleagues who have a lot of experience working internationally. I'm sorry that I haven't been able to hear the rest of the presentation, which might mean that I'm repeating some things that other people have said already, because as I went through thinking about what to write, I really felt that lots of what I was saying was not unique to speech and language therapy. I'd like to start first by telling you a little bit about Communication Therapy International, who's the group that I'm representing today. Communication Therapy International is broadly an equivalent of ADAPT, so it's an informal international network, and it welcomes anybody who's working in the field of communication or feeding disability. So it's not just speech and language therapists, it could be people with a disability themselves, therapists, teachers, doctors, parents and carers, community workers. We are planning to shift the way we work slightly to associate ourselves with the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists in the future, but we still want to keep this group open to other people. So in the spirit of multidisciplinary working, we'd really encourage any of you, if you're working and part of your work is supporting people with communication disability, please feel free to join us. And the contact details for our organisation will be at the end of the presentation. So I've said, a lot of what I will be talking about is not going to be theoretical. It's really a set of reflections and thoughts from myself and other people about working internationally and in multidisciplinary teams. I thought I'd start by just giving you a little bit of background about the kinds of people that speech and language therapists typically work with in low and middle income settings. And my guess is that perhaps some of our work is more widely in education than other people's work, maybe, but perhaps not. So we work with health colleagues, education colleagues, people in social care. Because speech and language therapy is so thin on the ground in every country, certainly in sub-Saharan Africa and in most low and middle income countries, we're quite often doing work that's really above the kind of grade we'd be doing in the UK, where we're working with policymakers, where we're working with national or international non-governmental organisations. And increasingly we're doing our work with organisations of and for people with disabilities themselves. A new area of work really, and I would include all of these as being different kinds of multidisciplinary teams, is that we're working more and more with higher education institutions where we are supporting people who are wanting to set up speech and language therapy or AHP training programs in low and middle income countries. And last but absolutely not least, for us, part of our work is working with people with communication disabilities and their families, either directly because we're part of a team that's working to support them, or sometimes they might be people who are helping us to deliver and develop services. So I canvassed my colleagues who have a lot of international experience and the CTI, Communication Therapy International Committee, and asked them for their thoughts about what makes a successful outside of speech and language therapy contribution to a multidisciplinary team in a low and middle income country. Bit of a mouthful. So I focus very much here on the work of what I call outsider speech and language therapists. So that's typically the kind of work we'd be doing coming from often a high income country and going into a low or middle income country setting. And these are our thoughts in no particular order. So one of the things that we thought was really important to start with was understanding whose idea it is to have a multidisciplinary team. And I know from my own experience, some of my very early work, I certainly felt that some of the people who wanted to work with me in a team were really about trying to gather a small, very much impairment-based, tertiary level service around, for example, ENT or voice services. And that didn't necessarily fit with my ideas about what I thought a multidisciplinary team might best be doing. So for me, I think it's really important to try and understand the background. I think when you're working in a multidisciplinary team, the same as in the UK, it's really important to understand what the goals are of that team and for them to be made really, really explicit so everybody knows what you're aiming at and why you're doing it. The next thing I think has been really important is to work out what's the added value of the multidisciplinary team. So if you're all working independently with a patient or a client and their family, what does it do if you bring a team together, and who does it give the added value to? Is it a good thing for us as professionals because we learn from one another, or we're all in the same room at the same time? Or is it really about benefiting things for the client or the patient? And either of those might be okay, just think we need to be really clear about it. Really related to that, I think the importance is of understanding one another's roles. So us really knowing our team, and I think that probably applies even more to speech and language therapists than it does to physiotherapists, for example, and occupational therapists, because we are even more junior partners in joining services in low and middle income countries. So often people don't know what we do. And related to that, really looking at our specific and unique roles so that we know what each one of us in the team is contributing, what we can do to support one another, and what are the unique things that we do. Related to that, I think understanding the culture of the individual professions is really important, whether it's around things like whether we wear a uniform, how we like to be addressed, what's the normal pattern of our day, how do we keep our records, how do we talk to and address other professions. Just really understanding those really small things that can be tough enough in the UK, but will be even more so in other countries that we're not so familiar with. Obviously, I had to put in a little bit of something around knowledge about communication and disability and speech and language therapy. So for me, it would be really important to understand what other people know, not just what I'm going to tell them. So what's their starting knowledge, both about communication disability, how it manifests itself, what are its causes, and also separately what people know about speech and language therapy. So for speech and language therapists, increasingly we're looking more towards thinking about services for people with communication disability rather than thinking about speech and language therapy. So thinking about who else can provide services to support people. I also think it's really important, along with agreeing explicit goals, is people's understanding of how much they expect to educate one another. Do you expect to learn from working in a multidisciplinary team in a way that will allow you to go out and take some of the knowledge you've gained to work with other people? Before I go any further, can I just check that you can all hear me okay?
Yes, I've done mine.
Okay. Sorry, your microphone isn't on. Is the sound okay for you? Okay.
Yes.
Great, thanks. Sorry. Okay, I'll keep going. All right, so I want to move on to our next slide, which is a continuation of this collation of ideas about what makes a successful contribution. Next two things really go very much together, and I think that's around making sure that you have, whether you're aiming at long-term work, and is it planned? So really it fits along with the goals, is what do we want to do, but are we just aiming for something that will be set up by next week and could stop at any point, or is there some long-term plan for this? And for me, that is absolutely tied up with making a sustainable contribution. So if you're working as a speech and language therapist from an outside a country and you're only going to be there for 6 months or a year or 2 years, what's going to happen after that? Is there a commitment from the funding and the sending body that there will be other speech and language therapists, or are there plans for training speech and language therapists locally, or for local people to go and be educated as speech and language therapists abroad and come back and take over your role? So really thinking about the long-term plan. One of my colleagues talked about the real importance for developing mutual respect and really working at building relationships between the multidisciplinary team members. I don't work very much, in fact at all, in the NHS, excuse me, in England now, but I know that because of the huge pressures that are on everybody, there's so much focus on actually getting on and delivering services that those parts of our work that are around building relationships and building respect are often the things that go. So I think that this is a really important thing and one that's really worth putting time into. And one of my colleagues who contributed ideas for this presentation was very explicit about how one of the teams that she had worked in really fell apart because those relationships and that mutual respect hadn't been built, hadn't been top down from the people who were wanting this team, which wasn't a health-based multidisciplinary team. They weren't really pushing for it to happen, and in fact the whole thing fell apart. So putting time aside to build relationships, I think, is really important, and that's very much related to my slightly silly comment about eating chocolate. I certainly find whenever I'm working with groups of people, if things start to get tough, if I've got bars of chocolate in my pocket, then that usually solves things, at least for short term. We have a cup of tea and a bar of chocolate and then try and work together again. So absolutely trying to find some time for your team to work together. If you have an outsider joining a multidisciplinary team, particularly one that is already functioning, then the importance of preparing that person not only for coming to work in the particular country, the particular town, the particular hospital, school, or social organisation, but also preparing them to work for that team really can't be underestimated. And catching little bits of the previous speakers' comments about understanding about how things are done in a particular setting, I think really emphasises that. So we absolutely have to go in without our understandings about, with a good understanding about how a team works in a particular place and what is it that we're joining. Something that I know lots of us have found really difficult, particularly if we're going to work somewhere short term, is the idea that you've got to give it time. That how a team is functioning in the first week or two is not how it's going to be in 6 months or a year. So really giving things time, watching and listening will increase the chance of something working well. And really related to building up relationships, the need to have some fun with the people that you're working with. It's serious work. Waiting lists are huge, people's needs are huge, but also we need to maintain our own mental health, and having a bit of fun and doing some good things together will increase the chance of the team lasting. And as a speech and language therapist, I never travel anywhere without post-its, flip chart paper and marker pens, and I think those have stood me in good stead for lots of things, that and chocolate. I wanted to move on now and think a little bit about what I think are the kind of skills that speech and language therapists need to have in order to increase their chances of working well in a multidisciplinary team. And again, I think lots of these will be the same for physiotherapists and other professionals. Listening really goes along with the idea of giving things time. Listening and watching and learning how teams are running currently before you jump in and start to try and change things and to tell people about how great our multidisciplinary teams are in the UK. Being really open-minded to other possible ways of doing things, again, is really important. Accepting other people's perspectives in terms of all sorts of different aspects of their work is really, really important. And with that, being prepared to be very flexible and very resourceful so that you're prepared to change the work and do things in a different sort of way. And really related to that is that acceptance that things aren't perfect, including the things that you do and other people do, including your knowledge, other people's knowledge, their skills and their priorities. So many of the people that I know I and my colleagues have worked with have trained on, been educated at universities where they're still developing their programs, and perhaps not everybody has the knowledge that we would like them to. Certainly because our work as speech and language therapist is language-based and extremely intertwined with culture, there's a huge lack of knowledge about things like language development norms, around cultural norms in relation to language, that we have to just be able to work with. Similarly, people's skills may be very varied depending on when and where and how they trained, and people's priorities are different. So we know it's really easy to come in as an outsider, full of enthusiasm, being a young, perhaps single volunteer who's prepared to work a 14-hour day, and understanding that the people that we work with might have 3 other jobs and a large family and lots of other responsibilities. So their priorities are not going to be solely on their work. Related to that, I've brought in the idea of cultural humility, and that's the idea of, it's really related to cultural competence, so people aren't familiar with it, the idea that you can never be fully knowledgeable about a culture that you haven't been born into. So that we are constantly, no matter how long we live in another community or another country, trying to understand how the world looks from that group of people's perspectives. And I think that really applies to the work that we do in multidisciplinary teams. Clearly understanding hierarchies around power, age, gender, how particular professions are viewed, how we're seen as speech and language therapists in relation to the medical doctors, for example, is really important. I also think it's really important to think about being assertive and about thinking about the things that are deal breakers for you. What are the differences in practice that you're prepared to go along with, and what are the deal breakers and the things that you would say this just isn't okay, and learning to let things go. So picking your battles, or as another colleague says to me about things that you have to let go, that you should be prepared to ditch your darlings and not do everything that you think is important. A few more thoughts, a little bit more from a speech and language therapy perspective. I think for speech and language therapists working in multidisciplinary teams, the thing that I learn more and more about over the years is that I need to know my stuff. I need to be able to explain it simply. I need to know what are the important concepts, and I need to know how to make my terminology simple in the host country or language. So for me, understanding exactly what is communication impairment, what is communication disability or activity limitation, and what are the kind of impacts on participation for people with communication problems. How do I explain that? What are the terms that are used for my work in other languages, and do they have the same meaning? So for example, in Rwanda, the national language Kinyarwanda has a word umva, which we were introduced to as being the word for understanding or comprehension, but it's also a word that happens to mean listening. For us as speech and language therapists, those two terms are really different, so we need to have ways to explain our terms and to explain carefully if in another language there's only one word for something we might divide into 2, 3 or 4 words. I need to know a lot about who can support people with communication disability. I need to be able to share with the other multidisciplinary team members what I understand about what community members know and believe about communication disability, so I can feed that in when we're thinking about how to advise people and how to support them. And also, I really need to share the support that people want. So people with communication disabilities and their families, what do I understand about what are their priorities that I can throw into the mix in a multidisciplinary team? I also need to know what really matters in terms of educating my colleagues. So as a young speech and language therapist first working abroad, I can remember teaching a group of nurses about being able to distinguish between dysarthria, dyspraxia and dysphasia. And now I think, does that really matter? What will I share with my multidisciplinary team members when I've got a really short amount of time? What can I teach? And what can I do with a family when, for example, I've only got 20 minutes? So those for us are all really important messages. I just thought I'd mention a few things that I think are challenges for us as speech and language therapists. Obviously, managing other members and managers and clients' expectations, which may not all be the same. People may think, as is common with other kinds of health conditions, that I'm going to give a medicine or an injection, that I'm going to be able to make a non-speaking child who's got severe brain damage be able to talk. So that's a big challenge for us. I need, really related to that, to think about whether people are expecting speech and language therapy delivered directly by speech and language therapists, or whether they're expecting other kinds of services for people with communication disabilities and how we can manage that. I need to understand a lot about the medical versus the social model of working with families, and how other people regard those two sometimes opposing models. It's really important for us to think in a wider multidisciplinary team, for example in an educational setting, about whether people are moving towards special education or inclusive education and the implications that has for us. We need to have an agreed definition of multidisciplinary working and what are the insider and outsider understandings of that, so that we're all working towards the same thing. In a multidisciplinary team, there are challenges depending on whether you're working in a generic team or a specialist team. Are we expecting each member of that team to work independently with their own very specialist skills, or are we expecting to skill share? I think it's really important that we don't overload our insider partners. So for us as speech and language therapists, being terribly enthusiastic about teaching everybody everything there is to know about our work, are we overloading people? And are we giving them financial costs if we expect them to do too much, if we expect them to turn up on training when they might have been doing their other job, when we're expecting people to work long hours, for example? There are real challenges for us around the boundaries of our role and what we consider to be ethical practice. Trying to ensure that we do things that are considered ethical in the UK and that we continue with our same ethical standards in other countries. And that is a real challenge if you know that you are the only person there who's able to support somebody. Where are the boundaries of your role? For us as speech and language therapists, we sometimes really want to challenge the idea, or always want to challenge the idea, that an outsider speech and language therapist is the best. So if you come in as an outsider and there is someone locally who's a speech and language therapist, trying to move people away from the idea that they would defer to you as an outsider. And I'd also, I think, we'd want to challenge when a multidisciplinary team is the right approach in a low resource setting. I don't have any answers for that, but I think for us always just thinking, when is that a right approach? Finally, I thought I would just finish with one example of a multidisciplinary team that I've been involved in recently. It's not a medical or a health-oriented multidisciplinary team at all, but I thought it might just be interesting to widen out a little bit our ideas of multidisciplinary team working. So the example that I've included is some work that I was doing with some colleagues, supporting them, actually for me just for a very short amount of time, in their work designing a speech and language therapy program in Rwanda. And this multidisciplinary team work had a number of the positive ingredients that I've been talking about earlier. So firstly, it really was multidisciplinary. We had a dean of the school at the university. We had a speech and language therapist, we had audiologist, I think we had a physiotherapist, we had the standards officer from the university, we had people from local NGOs. One of the things that was really important for me was that it was very clear to me what my role was and the boundaries of my role. We worked together to help do some work on designing a programme, and we used an approach of a theory of change, which I'm sure lots of you will be familiar with. We worked very hard. We were very clear about our outcomes, both short and long term, and what we could achieve in that day, on those few days we were working together, and what we would achieve in the future. We learnt a lot from one another, which I think was really important, and we also had quite a lot of fun. So I've just popped in the top left-hand photograph where one of the people in the team was leading us and doing some exercises and movement first thing in the morning, forming letters with our bodies that related to something that was current in the Rwandan news. So we managed to pull in lots of those aspects of a very short-term multidisciplinary team that I think will go on with some of the members to carry on designing a programme. And I think that we learnt a lot and it worked really well. So that's really all that I have to say to you. I hope that I've added something that hasn't been talked about already. If people are interested in Communication Therapy International, there's our website, Facebook, Twitter and email address, and we'd be delighted to have any and all physiotherapists join us. Thank you.
All together now, because you couldn't hear us. Thanks very much, Julie. That was a really interesting presentation and covered a lot in a short space of time. We're going to try using the roving mics to see if we can pick up the questions. But if not, I'll just say them to you.
Okay.
Any questions?
I stunned people into silence.
Yeah. No questions? Oh, one question. You just check the mic first so she can hear you.
Okay.
Maybe speak a bit closer. Can you hear that, Julie?
No, I couldn't, sorry.
Okay.
Can you repeat it, Hannah?
I'll tell you what, do you want to come here and say it? Because it might be a long one. Okay, changing plan. Sarah's coming to speak directly.
Okay.
Hi, Julie.
Hello.
Thanks for that. That was great. My question, I guess, was just about your discussion around outsider and insider therapists, and whether you felt that ever changes if people are there for a long period of time, say, whether you can move from outsider more into that kind of insider. I guess whether those two positions are as split as they seem.
It's a really interesting question, thank you, and it's one that we were discussing at a big conference in the summer of speech and language therapists. It's not a term that I think is perfect. I've got a PhD student at the moment whose work is all around insider and outsider contributions to speech and language therapy in one country in Africa, and it's interesting that it's not a perfect term. I think you're absolutely right to question it, and I would say it's probably more of a continuum, that hopefully you move more towards being an insider and an outsider as you go through your work. I think the concept of cultural humility is really important there, because I suppose what that says is that you can't ever truly be an insider because you haven't been part of that country for the whole of your life. I think the position that you occupy, insider, outsider, sometimes is affected by the particular thing that you're doing in a particular moment. And this is certainly what I've seen with a couple of colleagues who've been working in one particular country for 7 or 8 years, together with a colleague who is from that country and who has spent a lot of time in the UK, and even the person who's been who's an insider who's been outside and come back inside sometimes still feels like an insider. So I think it depends on the particular issue that's at hand, whether you might be an insider or an outsider. And also sometimes I think that term can be relative to other people. So if you've worked somewhere for a couple of years, you might be a relative insider compared to somebody who's just arrived. I just really like it as a notion because I think it really focuses us on thinking about and trying to understand some of the challenges that we might experience because we're not born and brought up in a particular community. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Thank you. It's really interesting to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, one more. Okay. It's a question around, it's a long question. It's a question around the balance of providing physiotherapy services and the access to services, speech and language therapy services, sorry, and accessing them. And the question was about I think maybe you come up and explain.
Yes.
Sorry.
I didn't hear any of it.
Better come. That's all right. You can't see you.
Hello?
Hello.
Oh, you can hear me okay?
I can, yes.
Good, thank you. I just wanted to pick up on a comment that you made, and you kind of talked about the role of, the way that you perceive the role of the speech and language therapist, and in terms of people being able to access services, to be able to live a good life, versus perhaps doing very specific speech and language therapy input. So I don't know if I understood correctly your comments and how you're going to go about that process.
Okay, I think, was it when I was talking about the difference between speech and language therapy and services for people with communication disabilities?
Yes, and kind of the role of the speech and language therapist within that.
So I think what that was really picking up on the fact that there are so few speech and language therapists, fewer even I think than physiotherapists. So typically in sub-Saharan Africa you might have one speech and language therapist for every 2, 4, 6, 8 million people. Some countries with no speech and language therapists, and certainly not speech and language therapists from that country. So I think there are a number of us who are looking at much more public health kind of approaches and much less specialist approaches, really saying we're never going to have even the very limited services that we've got in the UK in terms of being able to directly work with a speech and language therapist. So we've tried to make this shift very explicit by talking about services for people with communication disability that moves you beyond thinking that what you have to have is a speech and language therapist, but it could be a CBR worker, it could be a physiotherapist giving some extra support, it could be somebody who was a carer of somebody with a communication disability who might support somebody else, it could be a teacher, it could be a learning support assistant, it could be members from a disability rights organisation, it could be online services. So really looking at the whole package of the way you might provide services, which obviously then goes in hand also with a much more medical model, a much more social model of disability that's around decreasing stigma, increasing understanding of communication disability, and increasing people's abilities and confidence about communicating with people who've got communication disabilities. So it's really about sort of having a shift away from profession-specific services because of the lack of those specialists. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. Okay, I think we'll leave it at that, Julie, for time.
Okay.
Thank you so much for your virtual presence.
Thank you.
For a really interesting talk.
Okay, thanks for inviting me. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks very much.
Okay, bye.
Bye.